name of the living God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. So this parable today of the unjust judge is like two other parables of kind of shady characters that Jesus kind of raises up and talks about. And it's rather like the guy who comes to his neighbor at midnight, bangs on the door and said, some relatives have shown up late and I need some food. Or rather like that, the shrewd steward that Leon Botstein preached about a month ago, that wonderful sermon. And Jesus admires how shrewd he is. So here we have this unfortunate, unjust judge. The legal profession, even back then, didn't get a good rap. And you have this poor widow that we feel pity for. But the message is about persistence. And you can imagine he's in bed. She comes like a kind of annoying mosquito in the night. And he's just fed up and go away. Of course, I'll give you what you want. Just leave me alone. And Jesus says, well, God isn't really like that because we're not trying to convince God to do something that maybe God doesn't want to do. It may be part of our process of acceptance. We go through bargaining and denial, and then we come to acceptance. But certainly God should not be viewed the way the judge behaves. But the important message is about persistence, not giving up hope, that things will turn around somehow. I love that phrase, this too shall pass. Or what is done, what is not done, let it be. Kind of serenity. And then keep going. Or a phrase that is very relevant to our political life right now, a week is a long time in politics. Harold Wilson said that, how true that is. What's coming next? And so the parable is about, even in circumstances that seem futile and hopeless, are showing up and are making enough noise, can shift the outcome in a way that may surprise us. And the key to this is also about personal responsibility. This woman is not a victim. She's not blaming the legal system for her ills. She knows what she wants, and she's hoping to get what she wants. We might call that hope deferred. There's a wonderful poem by the Irish bard Seamus Heaney, who talks about when history and hope rhyme. And it's based on the Irish peace process. George Mitchell, many of you have followed George Mitchell's amazing career in the Senate. So here you have one of the best politicians in the world who goes to my country of Ireland to try and help the Irish stop killing each other in the name of God. And in his autobiography, he talks about that was the most difficult job he ever did. And he talks about 700 days of no and 1 day of yes. 700 days of no and 1 day of yes. And it took a whole lot of things happening at the same time to bring our community together and to have kind of shared values and a shared vision that we could move forward together. And I thought that I really admire his work. And I think that we've forgotten the Irish peace process was the best example of American foreign policy in the last 40 years. And we don't think about it, but it was. The Seamus Heaney poem goes like this. Human beings suffer, they torture one another, they get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain, or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. When hope and history rhyme. And I want to focus today on the character of Jeremiah, who's in our first reading. And many Christians, we don't really know who Jeremiah is. We think he's a kind of, prophet character from the Bible, and we know the book of Jeremiah, but we really don't have a context to understand how important Jeremiah is. And I want to give you a little background, because he was not only important to the Jewish community, who have this enormous political, cultural, religious upheaval called the exile, but he's also important to the human race. And he helps us go from our reptile brain of fight or flight into the neocortex, where we can start imagining a different kind of reality. And in doing so, our theology changes. In the reading today, for instance, he talks about it's God who does the sowing of life, animals and humans. And the old law of the idea was, okay, you're ill, or you're disabled, or you're punished by God because something your parents or your grandparents did. And what he talks about is this radical change of theology, that's no longer, that old covenant's over, people. We now have to take responsibility for what we all do. No more blaming. Take responsibility. And again, the context in which he lived about 1,600 years ago in this little country, Judah, that was very prosperous. And again, I look at what we have in common in our day. What are the lessons from Jeremiah in his time that we can apply to us in the United States in the 21st century? And what we have in common is that we believe that we're kind of God's chosen. God has blessed us. We're the light on the hill. We have the truth. Every main religion has had to deal with the idea of being the chosen people. Right? And so there's a kind of privilege in that. There's assumptions in that. And in Jeremiah's time, that was expressed, we are God's chosen people. We have the covenant. Nothing can possibly hurt us or harm us. And religion and God was kind of distant, and you kind of went to church and you put your money in the plate, and that was it. There was no kind of inner moral, ethical, emotional response. And so Jeremiah, he's not a preacher. He's a farmer. He's a reluctant prophet. He has this funny kind of relationship with God, but God gets a hold of him and says, I don't want to be distant anymore. I want you to help change the way people think about me. And I want you to kind of model this little community in the middle of the Middle East, tiny little community surrounded by different cultures, traditions. People were having fun, people were doing rain dances and fertility cults and having sex, having a great old time. I want this group of people to be different. And I want you to begin that revolution. And that is a kind of early incarnation. We think about God becoming flesh in Jesus. God becomes flesh in Jeremiah. Early incarnation. And he compares it to being seduced. He's kind of attracted to it, but he's frightened of it. When we start messing with the holy, it's not all kumbaya. And these people, and so he was called to kind of speak truth to power. And I compare him to a kind of early Edward Snowden. Look what your government's doing. Look what's happening in the world, people. Reality check. And just as Snowden is a traitor and locked up, or he would be locked up if he was in this country, they locked Jeremiah up. We don't want to hear this message. And the message was, we've lost our way. We've lost our values, and an outside force is going to come and take over. And we have to kind of reform. We have to revolutionize the way we are in our society, and they didn't listen. And sure enough, Babylon invades. And the imperial power, they're gentle. They take the leadership, they take the intelligentsia away, they take the king away, they replace him with his uncle. Jeremiah is released from prison. And it's interesting that the traitor becomes the voice of solidarity and future for the exiles, right? So they're taken off and they don't know who they are anymore. They're living in Babylon. And he says to them, be where God wants you to be. We don't know the mystery of God. God is acting in a way that we haven't realized before, but trust it. And plant seeds in the land and marry and be where you are, and God is with you. And maybe God is in action in this invasion. And that was a radical theological position, because our God is our God of territory. His theology was about a widening of God. No longer was God in the temple, God is in our heart. So wherever you are in exile, God is with you. That was the lesson today. And it was a revolutionary way of thinking about religion. So I want us to kind of apply that to our own world today. The idea that somehow, what is it that we're doing in our imperial certainty, in our kind of chosen us? We're right. We know it all. Now, I love it that we call ourselves Americans, but what could the Mexicans and the Canadians and the Cubans teach us about being American? Right? And how do we widen the circle of concern that was very much a part of the message of Jeremiah 1,700 years ago? Extraordinary. Globalization. And that God was active in this, and that God would somehow fix it and bring us back to reality. I had two experiences this past week that made me think about this. The first was last Friday, I attended a meeting at Riverside Church called God and Guns. And it brought 100 pastors and religious leaders together to talk about gun violence, because it's a very difficult thing for us to talk about in church. And there was an evangelical pastor who had spent most 30 years working in the anti-abortion arena. Very much evangelical, very concerned about values, family values, and so on. So he was chairman of the Evangelical Pastors Association of America. Huge guy, right? And there's a mother whose son, 14 years old, was brutally killed by guns in Atlanta. And she went to him and said, can you help me convince the church that this is something the church should be concerned about? 91 people die every day in America of gun violence. Why aren't we talking? We're praying about it, but why aren't we doing something about it? And he was kind of convicted to do something. So we started talking to his fellow pastors and going around. And there's a film called The Armor of Light, which is about this journey that he embarks on, talking to religious leaders. And to his amazement, he found that many of the pastors actually carried firearms themselves, often in the pulpit. And that kind of gun culture was very much a part of Christian culture in this country. And basically they talked about, there are two logics. One is, if you have a gun, well, bad people won't be able to do bad things. Because if good people have guns, then bad things won't happen. And there's the other logic that the more guns you have, then it's more prone to violence, and people will use them and react badly and so on. But what the conclusion that he came to was that actually it's a theological problem. It's not a problem of violence. It's actually a theological problem, because we have made the gun our God. We know we are fearful, and we put our security in guns rather than in God. And I thought, this is a different way of thinking about this. So the idolatry of the church in putting the idea of a pastor, coming to church armed is something we probably don't think about. So that was kind of one experience, and it's very interesting about how do we engage that conversation. And I know this community, everybody, guns in gun clubs and Tamarack is a very different conversation. But again, the invitation is we can't duck it. We have to engage our brothers and sisters in Chicago and in other parts of this country to figure out how we reduce gun violence. And it's not about gun control, because again, that's the wrong framing. The issue is about violence that we all agree is horrific and we have to do something about it. So that was one story. Then this past week, I was invited to attend a fundraiser for the Incarnation Camp, which is an wonderful Episcopal camp. And David Brooks, the political commentator, was the speaker. And it was at the Princeton Club quite near our home in New York. So I walked over and it was really very interesting. It was a big fundraiser. But he told the story about when he was a kid, he went to that camp. It was and it really shaped his values. And he met people that he wouldn't normally have met. And he joked, at one point he told the story, he said, my parents were kind of left-wing hippies, and they would have fiery barrels, and they would all throw in their wallets, condemning capitalism. And he said, I realized I moved from the left to the right when I pulled out a burning $5 bill one day when I was 11. So he was very funny and light about, but he talked about, we thought he was going to talk about the election, and he did, but he didn't really talk about the election. And one of the things he said, it's becoming more and more difficult for us in our modern day to engage with people who are different from us. Everybody's kind of living in their own little worlds. And he said, when I was a kid, the camp for me was the way that I engaged. I met people who were different from me. And it shaped the values throughout my life. And so it was a great plug for the camp. But then he said, for instance, the two main characters in this election, what do they do for fun? Do we really know them? And so he was talking about that with technology and media, that we've created these kind of one-dimensional people who are symptoms of this alienation that's going on all over the country. And he spent a couple of months on the road just finding out what's going on for people. And at the end of his talk, his talk was really fascinating. And at the end of his talk, there was a Q&A, and I, of course, wanted to ask him a question. I said, so you guys in the media are making tons of money right now. Your ratings are off the charts, and you're having all this money for elections. It's coming through the media. What are you guys going to talk about after January? And he said, I'm going to talk about intimacy. I'm going to talk about intimacy. I'm going to write about it. And I'm going to encourage different ways in which our institutions that we no longer trust can start connecting with people and bringing people together who don't know one another, really. And in the same way that I did as a kid in the camp. And I thought that was really profound. That was not, we all went to hear, thought we were going to hear about the election. And he turned it into a kind of spiritual reflection, which I thought was really, really fascinating and helpful. Sarah Stack had a meeting of local community people around the Berkshire Deconic Foundation on Friday, and it was a really great gathering, just talking about what's going on in this community. And it was very interesting the way the faith community has, in some ways, we're on the front lines of this economic divide that we're seeing in our world. And the issue was, we can Band-Aid and we can fix, but who's really looking at the systemic stuff? And that's the big question, about how do we get people who have the know-how and the resources to really go beyond the Band-Aiding that we're all involved in, And after that discussion, I realized that a lot of that, back to Brooks's idea of thinking, how do we create intimacy in our communities? You know, some of us write checks, some of us volunteer, but how do we really start to get to know our people and what's going on for them? And that idea of the widow, the persistent widow knocking for justice, and that transformational moment when hope and history rhyme. And what a great image that is for us today from Jeremiah as we move out of the chosen privilege, we know it all, a different way of thinking about God and the incarnation of God in each one of us that Jeremiah started. Amen.